Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to be continuing working on the fretboard for the giveaway guitar, but you may have noticed I'm wearing this cool guitar themed t-shirt. I actually printed this out myself. It's not all that hard. And I made myself a new leather fedora. First time I've ever done that before. It's kind of a cool experience. Maybe someday I'll show it to you. But in the meantime, let's get busy on this fretboard. I had to start today's project by cutting our two fretboards apart. Then I wanted to trim up the edges a bit just to give myself a straight edge to work with. I picked out the fretboard I wanted to use, and then I started laying my template down just so I could get an idea of what it would look like. And I played around a couple of times until I got that, I like to call it a galaxy. It looks like a galaxy up there, that knot. So once I got that centered on the board, I went ahead and started cutting it out. Now that this piece is no longer straight, it's actually tapered, I need to give myself a reference line to use as a center line. So I'm going to carefully mark each end to give myself a center, and I'm going to use that from now on as my center line for this fretboard. Now keep in mind, my center line doesn't actually have to be in the center of this board, but I always have to use my center line as my reference point. Because if I don't, my frets won't line up, they'll be crooked and things won't play just right. But if I use my center line for my reference point, all my frets will be cut at a 90-degree angle to that center line and things will be just fine. So with my center line established, now I've got to make sure I get it perfectly straight onto my jig that cuts my frets, or my fret slots. So I'm going to carefully line up the center line on my template to the center line on my fretboard, and then everything will be square. Now I'm all ready to cut the frets, but I really don't know how deep to cut the frets just yet. So I have to do a little math to figure that all out. Now this is a critical step. You can't skip this step. If you get the cut too shallow, your frets will not go all the way down into the fretboard and they'll stick out of the ground like trees. We don't want that. So we have to make sure that we cut deep enough that it gets planted all the way down flat to the fretboard. But at the same time, we don't want to cut our slots so deep that we risk breaking our fretboard in half. So that's why this is very critical. Now I have an initial calculation that I do, and then I have a confirmation calculation that I do as well, just to back up my answer. So I'm going to go through both of these here. And after some quick calculations in my head, I come up with 42. Now we need to see if the secondary calculation actually equals the first calculation, so we'll know if we've got the right depth or not. And just like before, we came up with an answer of 42, so I guess that's the depth we need to cut, 42. When you first get into building guitars, you're going to have to figure out some way to cut your fret slots. You're going to have two options. You're going to have a hand tool version that you can get at StewMac or LMI, and they're going to be $200-300 for their adjustable little jigs. Plus you're going to have to buy this template that I'm using. Or you can spend $100 on one of the saw blades that I'm using and go buy a used table saw somewhere, and you'll be roughly in that same ballpark. I went with the table saw route because Now I can use it for other woodworking projects. I've got a nice tool, plus it accomplishes the task of cutting my fret slots. If you want to go and do it the hand method, by all means do, but I found this to be the more practical solution. Now, the only trick here is to get your fretboard off the jig without breaking your fretboard in half. So far, knock on wood, I haven't had one break yet, but you just never know. Next on the list is to cut the taper onto the fretboard, and then just after that, we're going to put a radius on the fretboard as well. For both of those steps, I have the fretboard attached to this template. So it's really important I get it put on there straight using my center lines, and then I'll go out and start doing the cuts. You also really don't want this to move around, so don't be scared to use a lot of tape here. Now, it's usually best to route going into the cutter bit like I am on this side, but on the second side here, you're going to see pretty quickly that it starts chipping out on the edge. So to prevent it from chipping, I actually went backwards. It nibbles away at the cut and prevents chips, but it can rip the piece out of your hand. So you have to be careful when you go that direction. I have to swap out the router bit to the binding cutter bit, so I'm swapping a bit. Right now this fretboard is about as wide as the cutter on this router bit. So I'm probably going to end up with a little feather edge that didn't quite cut. That's not a big deal. But just so you know, the fretboard is just about as thick as this bit. Now notice I'm going backwards again. That's because I knew it had a tendency to chip out. But you can see by the bearing on the router bit that I'm not quite pushing hard enough to keep that bearing from spinning. So that means there's still a little bit of wood there left to cut. See how it's spinning the wrong way here? It should be spinning the opposite direction, but it's not. So I don't quite have enough pressure there, but I'm cutting like 95% of it. So now I can turn around right here, go the opposite direction, and get it nice and clean. And of course here I'm cleaning up those little fuzzies I was talking about that didn't quite get cut. But it looks good. The taper's cut and the binding channels are cut, so now it's time to radius the fretboard. I always use a compound radius, and maybe someday I'll do a video on why I use a compound radius, but just so you know, this is a compound radius. And just like before, to prevent chip out on the edges, I make sure I do each edge in the direction of the arrows on the jig. That just cuts the very outside edge and prevents any chipping. Then from there, it doesn't really matter which direction I go. As long as I go the length of the fretboard, everything will be nice and smooth. If I tried to go with, left and right, left and right, left and right, it's going to leave a whole bunch of grooves all over the fretboard. So make sure you go this direction. Now, think about this for a second. I'm using a square bit to make a round corner or a round surface. So if I just made 3 passes, I'd get a fretboard that felt like a stop sign. So the more passes you can make, the smoother it's going to be right off the bat, and the less sanding you're going to have to do afterwards. This is a scary part, trying to get that back off there again without breaking the fretboard. So if I can make it past that, everything's good. So there you go. Other than doing a little bit of math to figure out the depth of the cut, everything was pretty easy, and we just used templates and jigs. So I think anybody with the right stuff, right tools can actually do this quite easily. So thanks for watching, everybody. If you haven't entered to win that giveaway guitar, this giveaway guitar, make sure you subscribe here, then go to my website, spenceracoustics.com, fill out a little 2-line form that pops up, and just like that, you're entered to win.